Okay, so I think we can get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to this panel called Sugar's Traces. My name is Rachel. I work at AC4, which is a research center at the Earth Institute of Columbia University.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Soraya Lamar, and I'm a third-year PhD student in the Department of French at Columbia.
Hi, everyone. Really excited to have you here. My name's Erin, and I'm a second-year PhD student in French at NYU. This is the first event as part of our larger digital humanities project called Ecologie Entrelacée. The overarching theme of the project is to interrogate questions of how colonialism and capitalism have shaped relationships between humans and land, and how these themes tie patterns of domination to both environment and gender in the Francophone Caribbean. The project is bilingual in French and English, and while our focus is primarily on the Francophone Caribbean, we want to acknowledge also that the connections within the Caribbean go beyond language and draw national boundaries. So we are hoping this project can contribute to building resources and community around the overt effects of climate change in the region, while also elevating the humanities and social sciences in discussions of environmental issues. We're also hoping to build a community of friends and peers through this project as a remedy to the isolation that is defining these times. The Environmental Humanities Project's focus is on gender in the Caribbean, which allows for reflection on some of the most urgent crises of our present moment. We hope to make this a space for creativity, collaboration, as well as pushes for environmental justice.
So the larger goal of this project is to look at the nuances of how narratives of ecology and gender have been systematically suppressed and reduced, yet conversely, how these same narratives, individuals and collectives, continuously resist and disorder structures of power. So to do this, we've chosen 4 subtopics, which are sugar, bananas, beaches, and gardens. So these are commodities and spaces that are foundational to the Caribbean in both concrete and abstract ways, and serve as symbols of the histories of social, economic, cultural, and ecological consequences. So this first event focuses on sugar, its historical role in plantation slavery, colonialism, its production, its consumption, and how it functions as a symbol in 2 different media. So in this case, literature and visual art. But as the name of this project suggests, Ecologie Entrelacée, we are insisting on the interconnectedness and intertwined nature of spaces, elements, and commodities. So sugar is the entry point into a larger discussion of interwoven ecologies. So you'll hear about other elements in this talk, including water.
Before we introduce our speakers, we just wanted to offer gratitude and extend some thank yous to people who have been critical in this event and the general project. This project was born out of and further developed into classes at Columbia University that we would like to acknowledge. First, the course entitled Disorderly Women in spring of 2020, taught by Professor Kayama Glover, where we looked at disorderly narratives of women in Caribbean literature. We noticed ecological and environmental connections in the literature. And when the COVID situation was building and uncertainty and everything rapidly shifting to being online, Professor Glover encouraged us to carry out projects that would last beyond the class. And the seeds of that project were planted to bloom into this.
And we also were further supported in this project through the Caribbean Digital course taught this semester by Professor Alex Hill and Professor Glover. And this provided more foundation for this project in Caribbean Digital Humanities work. We would also like to thank the Barnard Center for Research on Women and the Institute of Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Columbia University, who have very generously co-sponsored this convening. And then lastly, we would like to thank our 2 wonderful speakers who have agreed to participate in this project, Dr. Myriam Chancy and Andrea Chung, whose amazing work you will hear about more directly from them.
Thank you all for being here. I see from the chat many different geographical locations. This is very exciting. Let me introduce, before we start, our two wonderful speakers, Dr. Myriam Chancy and Andrea Chung. We're very lucky to have them with us today and be able to learn from them. Dr. Myriam Chancy will speak on Harvesting Haiti, Unnatural Disasters. She is a Guggenheim Fellow and Hartley Burr Alexander Chair of the Humanities at Scripps College and an award-winning novelist. Her Guggenheim-sponsored monograph, Autochtonomies, Transnationalism, Testimony, and Transmission in the African Diaspora, was published in 2020 with the University of Illinois Press, and her novel on the Haiti earthquake, What Storm, What Thunder, is forthcoming from HarperCollins Canada and Tin House USA. Past novels include The Loneliness of Angels, The Scorpion's Claw, and Spirit of Haiti. Academic publications include From Sugar to Revolution, Women's Visions from Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, Framing Silence, Revolutionary Novels by Haitian Women, and Searching for Safe Spaces, Afro-Caribbean Women Writers in Exile. Our second speaker, Andrea Chung, will discuss the role of sugar in her visual art that focuses on colonialism and slavery in the Caribbean. She received a BFA from Parsons School of Design, New York, and an MFA from Maryland Institute College of Art, Baltimore. Her recent Biennale and museum exhibitions include Prospect 4, New Orleans, and the Jamaican Biennale, Kingston, Jamaica, as well as the Chinese American Museum and California African American Museum in Los Angeles, and the San Diego Art Institute. She was featured in the Museum of the African Diaspora's Spring 2019 exhibition entitled Coffee, Rum, Sugar, and Gold, a Post-Colonial Paradox. And before we hear both speakers themselves, I will give an overview of how the panel will be structured. First, Dr. Chancy will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by Andrea Chung. Then there will be time at the end for each panelist to respond to one another, as well as for Q&A. So please write any questions you may have in the Q&A function you can see at the bottom right of your screen. And with this, I hand the floor to Dr. Myriam Chancy.
Bonjour, bonsoir, hello everyone. Myriam Chancy here to start us off. I just wanted to begin by thanking Rachel swearing this and their entire team for Écologie Entrelacée. And I will just get started right away by sharing my screen. I've prepared a PowerPoint to go along with what it is that I'm to say here. Let me just get this on the full screen. Here we go. So when we started having conversations about this meeting, the organizers talked to me about my past work, a second to last book, which you see behind my shoulder here, From Sugar to Revolution, and the ways that I had talked in that work, which is a book of criticism on the legacy of sugar for Haiti in conjunction with the Dominican Republic and also with Cuba. And in that work, one of the things that I was attempting to articulate was the idea that in the contemporary space, we need to think of sugar not only in terms of its original plantation product, but we need to think about the ways in which women in the Caribbean, particularly in these three nation states, have themselves become commodified as sexual objects and how women writers have been writing them out of that space. But today, what I'd like to do is to kind of give you a sense of a trajectory of how I've been thinking about sugar and water in particular in three particular ways, which will allow me to share a little bit of my work, forthcoming work, post-earthquake work that has to do with water especially, and how water is a very difficult to come by commodity, but we need to think about it in different kinds of ways. So there'll be three motions in my talk drawn from both a forthcoming novel on the earthquake called What Storm, What Thunder, and a collection of nonfiction essays that I wrote in response to the political and social situation from 2010 to 2015, which is called Harvesting Haiti, and will be out, both of which will be out in the fall of 2021. So the first movement is Zafras and self-sufficiency, and I'll talk about the connection of the history of sugar in Haiti to the decision of the Constitutional Tribunal of the Dominican Republic to denationalize Dominicans of Haitian descent in 2013, an order which still stands today. Then I'll move to runes and some outtakes from What Storm, What Thunder, and enter into a conversation about the flooding of a market with imported water and other goods, and also who has access to water in the post-earthquake situation. And then that will lead me to a very brief discussion of development schemes in Haiti post-earthquake, and a particular example, the Caracol Industrial Park, which threatens the Three Bays National Marine Park, which was declared in 2014 as a site to preserve the ecological landscape there. So let's begin with Zafras and self-sufficiency. This is an outtake from an essay called Love Thy Neighbor, which was published in Trinidad and Tobago in an insert of a newspaper there, when I was trying to think through what it meant to have had this tribunal edict come down in 2013. And here I trace some of the history of sugar in the area. By the early 1900s, many Dominican cane plantations were owned by US sugar companies. These started importing Haitian labor as early as 1916 to 1924 during the occupation of both sides of the island. Most Haitian migrants were going to Cuba from 1912 to 1930, and then started reorienting to the DR when Cuba stopped admitting immigrant laborers in 1930, both of Jamaican and Haitian extraction. In 1933, Trujillo passed a law requiring that 70% of cane field workers be Dominicans. Coincidentally, when Trujillo massacred 40,000 Haitians, and let us state it, dark Dominicans from the border zones in 1937, Cuba expelled 25,000 Haitian migrants who dispersed to neighboring nations if they did not return to Haiti. Interestingly, like the DR today, Cuba did not deport immigrant workers with significant economic resources. It would not be until 1959 and the rise of the Castro Revolution that the Haitian would become an ennobled figure in Cuba. At the same time, the dictator François Duvalier came to an agreement with the Dominican Republic by which the Haitian state was paid a fee for every Haitian cane cutter supplied to the Dominican Republic, while the laborers themselves received slave wages. Once the richest colony in the New World, from which it is estimated that 1/7 of the population of France derived its income directly or indirectly, this is before the revolution, the impact of the Haitian Revolution began the slow unraveling of its economic state as the new nation found its footing in the New World. Cut out of global trade by its former masters and forced to pay a war debt to France for France's losses by President Boyer in 1843, a sum of 150 million French francs estimated at $22 billion in today's US currency, Haiti progressed in a slow decline. In the meantime, the newly freed slaves refused to cut cane and sugar production shifted to the Latin Caribbean countries of Santo Domingo, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Ironically, it was Boyer who introduced cane and coffee cultivation to the DR, and Haitians began to migrate to the DR for the Zafra cane cutting season, returning to their own land after the season. For decades after 1804, and as the border between the two territories shifted so that wide swaths of land belonged alternately to Haiti or to Santo Domingo or the Dominican Republic as far east as present-day Ange, now in Haiti, once known as Hincha in Santo Domingo, Haitians traded with their neighbors and vice versa quite freely. In these areas, Haitian currency was the primary form of exchange until 1947, long after the period of the Trujillo instigated massacre. Haitians and Santo Domingo natives intermarried, traded, had children. When the US occupied both countries, in a period which was to see the last of political collaboration between Haitian and Dominican counter forces, leaders on both sides of the border were actually related by marriage. across ethnic divides, harbored each other when situations required it on opposite sides of a border, and provided armed support as needed. By the time Trujillo ratcheted up the national discourse of whitening in the 1930s, it was truly impossible to tell a Haitian from a Dominican in the border zones. When I returned to Haiti in November of 2013, I was surprised that there was not more talk about the tribunal ruling on the other side of the border. For the most part, Haitians considered the issue a domestic one, a Dominican problem. For many Haitians, Dominicans of Haitian descent seem to occupy an especially abject position, that of a progeny of Haitians who were too poor to stay in Haiti or had no land to return to, the poorest of the poor. Yet others told me that the ruling was incidental to trade issues. It's because of the eggs, some told me. What eggs? I asked. Egg production, I was told. Martelly, the then president, announced that Haiti would produce its own eggs for domestic production in August, and we were slammed with this in September. Bilateral trade between the two nations is extremely skewed. Economist Paul Latortue, based in Puerto Rico, reports an increasing income gap from 1960 to the present between Haitians and Dominicans, and that in 2010 only, the DR sold 250 times what it purchased from Haiti. In that same year, Haiti sold $60 million worth of products, but imported 1.5 billion. Its cheap migrant labor force aside then, the DR has a lucrative business in Haiti that depends upon Haiti's inability to rise as a competitor in local and global trade. This is all to say that if the Dominican Republic has not engaged in regulation of immigration from Haiti prior to this time, short of massacres, it has been more than willing to extract labor from Haitians and to pay a pittance for it. The current ruling does not seek to regulate immigration. It strips Dominican citizens who are not Haitian but happen to be of Haitian descent of their rights by birth. It violates every known convention of international law by which world citizens are assured of their rights and are protected from retroactive rulings that would attempt to legislate the ethnic or religious composition of any given nation. That retroactive ruling goes back to 1929, which is the year before Trujillo comes into power, because he comes into power in 1930. And 1930 is also the year that it was found that Haiti had been given less than its fair share of a border zone when the two countries were trying to erect a border zone. And that dispute went on until 1935. And then the massacre, when Trujillo clears land that he actually then takes for himself, happens in 1937. So the retroactive nature of the ruling to 1929 is very particular and is related then to this idea of exploitation of Haitians for relegating them only to cane cutting and cane production. So here I'll move forward to my second point on the slide here, that you've been seeing. I note that it takes a lot of water to produce sugarcane. And Haiti is rich in natural resources, as you can see from this slide, looking over the waters between Port-au-Prince and La Gonâve. And this has become an issue as there's been so much battling over the resources of Haiti through the earthquake situation. When the earthquake occurred, very few people realized that there was this kind of scurrying for the resources. And one of the things I want to underscore throughout this presentation is that local Haitians who were affected by the earthquake know how to produce for themselves. And this is one example, terrace farming in La Gonâve, a picture I took after the earthquake, of course, in 2011, which ensures that people can draw from the earth, use rainfall, that when there are flooding situations, that their crops are not taken away. And within the camps themselves, the displaced people camps, individuals who did not even have access to potable water found a way to maintain their dignity. So here you see in a camp that has been dismantled since. In 2011, this camp was in the Champ de Mars. in the center of Port-au-Prince, an elderly woman taking part in the traditional wash day using whatever is available. So what I want to move to is this idea of coexisting with runes, that in Port-au-Prince in particular, but also in Léogâne, in Jacmel, in these areas close to the epicenter, people are still today coexisting with ruins of national monuments such as the cathedral in Port-au-Prince, or in a moment that I captured here in 2011, debris that has been swept away to the side, and yet there is still commerce going on in the street. So here this young woman is walking across a young man who is selling sunglasses, cell phones like the one that she's holding on to. So in the novel, What Storm, What Thunder, what I try to do is to think through what it has been like for Haitians to coexist with those runes, what occurred for them, and what commodifications occurred during this period. So I'm going to read two excerpts that are going to be intermeshed with some more of my photographs to give you an idea not only of the novel, but some of what I'm getting at in terms of this issue of who has access to what, and in particular, water. The first outtake is from a young woman named Tafia, who is 15 years old at the time of the earthquake. And one of the things that we know happened in many of the camps is that not only was there food insecurity, water insecurity, but there was physical insecurity. There were many rapes in the camps, and she is a young woman who unfortunately has this occurrence. And so she is being followed in the camp by someone who, a male teenager who was pursuing her before she entered the camp. So this is just a very short paragraph in Tafia's voice speaking to her situation in the camp. I stumbled backward, started walking in the opposite direction to make it look like I hadn't been moving toward the red flag. And the red flag is how she can tell where her tent is in the camp. Though I knew he now knew it was ours, I heard him laughing at my back, then calling out to a friend. When I couldn't hear him or see him, if I looked back over my shoulder, I tried to look for the flag again. There was too much heat, too many flies, too many bodies. How long would we be without a door to our name, without locks, having to spend every day looking for food and water, depending on the foreigners to come with their trucks of provisions that were not what we needed or reserved for a better class of people? How we long for the clear bottled water they put up to their lips nonchalantly as they peered at us, smiling hesitantly, playing with the children who always welcomed attention. How we longed for a return home. And so I wanted to invoke this sense of place and displacement within the Haitian landscape for local Haitians, and thinking then about water and natural disasters and unnatural disasters, because we also know that the devastation of the earthquake was unnatural because this is a city that was meant for 250,000 people, designed for that number, which was filled with millions of people and in unstable conditions. So here you see an IDP camp, which was set up in a ravine alongside one of the main roads in Port-au-Prince. And you can imagine that that particular IDP camp would have been overwhelmed with water during flooding periods. And what were people receiving? Well, in terms of material aid, they were receiving tarps from USAID. They were receiving tarps from the Irish government. In 2020, January 2020, the numbers were still showing that there were 50,000 Haitians estimated to be living in these kinds of shelters that were meant to be temporary, so 10 years later. We have to keep in mind that Digicel, the largest portable phone provider in the country, is owned by Irish nationals, that the US has blocked Haiti's ability to raise its minimum wage since the 1990s, and obliterated the agricultural sector and limited the country, well, Haitians to low-wage factory work, which I'll turn to in the final part of my presentation. But I want to turn to another excerpt from the novel, because the novel doesn't only focus on Haitians who had a relative consciousness of the realities of what it was to live in Haiti at this time. It also presents some Haitians who may or may not have lived through the earthquake and whose dispositions were towards capitalist production. And so I have a picture here taken by a US Navy photographer of pallets of water, which were brought in January 2010, time when local NGOs, aid groups, were really telling people to not come into Haiti, to let those who knew Haiti best, who had been working there for 20, 30, 50 plus years, to handle the situation and to send in monetary aid instead. And what occurred when this water came in is that it was first distributed to foreigners, to NGO workers and aid workers, rather than people who were suffering without water. And so with this in mind, I introduce you to Richard, who is a character who bottles water. Without water, let's face it, we're nothing. We are born with a makeup of 75% water that diminishes with time. Until we dry up, if we stay in good health, the content of water in the body stays above 50% and doesn't fall below 45%, even if the cause is gross obesity. It's a strange fact, but the fatter you are, the less water there is in your body proportionally. The thinner you are, the more liquid. In all cases, water is needed to survive so that joints remain flexible, supple, articulations and digits in shape, flexible. Boiled water is decontaminated for the most part. Pure water in certain parts of the world is harder to find. It's used there rather than for drinking or cultivation to light the homes of the wealthiest, as in India, where huge dams have been built to divert water to energy plants, flooding the land of the peasants who depend on both land and water to grow food. The powers that be import their food, and the peasant farmers starve to death or die of thirst or hang themselves. Looking out onto those dams, as I've done in my travels, you feel like a gnome, puny and minuscule. Kilometers of land were flooded to build them, to make the water recirculate where the earth had not placed it naturally. I know you've never heard of the farmer suicides, but they've happened, hundreds, thousands of them. I don't know how many, I'm not paid to keep those numbers in mind, but it's a lot. Anything you drink, filtered water has been added to it, but pure filtered bottled water in the third world is not that easy to find. In a general sense, it's a luxury. If you're the last remaining of a dispossessed, you can make a rock soup and whatever else you can get your hands on. When I was young, we boiled the water, let it cool, poured it into clean glass milk bottles, then set them in a fridge or a cool place. There was no other choice. Later on in his chapter, he's asked what he does, and he says, I'm into water. And the response is, are you serious? To which he says, yes, I'm serious. I was slightly insulted. Who could not be serious when it came to water, especially here? You see, I continued, letting the words linger here, like where you came from, or in Bangladesh or Timbuktu. Water is dear, it's expensive, and everyone needs it. The problem is that not everyone can afford it. You understand? It's my challenge to package something that everyone should be able to raise from the earth, but can't. They have other things to do, and to sell it back to them as if it had never been theirs in the first place. I'm selling convenience, purity, the essence of life itself. So this brings me to the issue of underdevelopment, of course, cueing Walter Rodney. And I'd like to conclude by speaking a little bit about the Caracol Park. So Three Bays protected area is this area that you see on the map here. And Caracol, if you can see my arrow, is this very small city here. And Three Bays National Marine Park was in the works before the earthquake, but it was certified in 2014. The Caracol Industrial Park is just a little bit inland from the city itself. And I will show you here what the protected areas that the national park is intending to preserve delimit: mangrove, coral reef, and seagrass areas, which are important not only to Haiti's ecosystem, but all of the area. And so I'd like to read from an essay called Haiti Campé, What Dreams Are Made Of, which addresses the Caracol Industrial Park issue and the issue of development. Luxury hotels to eco-tourist schemes, such as mountain bike races and trails, are currently in development, and though some, like the latter, are well-meaning, they fail to adequately ascertain local impact or include the least wealthy Haitians in their plans. This is trickle-down economics at its best, yet those involved in these enterprises do not seem to have learned much from the current global economic meltdown, clinging as they are to the delusion that capitalist expansion will somehow save Haiti. Tourist schemes, along with massive factories like the Caracol Industrial Park, only recently reported upon, but being implemented since shortly after the earthquake in the North Coast zone between Cap-Haïtien and Fort Liberté, are the plan for Haiti's future, with little regard for essentials needed in the present by the poorest of the poor and those struggling for a better quality of life. Caracol is little known to outsiders, but it is actually a premier historical site for all of the Americas. It is here that Christopher Columbus first landed the Santa Maria on December 5th, 1492, thinking that he had discovered the Indies. Interestingly, rather than exploit this history for ecotourism, although I have read that there are plans for Christopher Columbus amusement park, the Haitian and US governments, along with the Inter-American Development Bank, without conducting the proper site evaluations, have developed an industrial park promising 20,000 jobs to locals that have yet to materialize, while evicting area farmers from lands they have tilled for generations. The ecological importance of Caracol cannot be underestimated. Just prior to the earthquake, this area was selected as Haiti's first marine protected area. Shortly after, it was selected to become yet another industrial park, similar to the Métropolitain Industrial Park in Port-au-Prince, which has had the effect there of turning Cité Soleil into a vast slum, the largest in the hemisphere. Local fears the slumization of their town, currently home to divested farmers and local fishermen who pull enough from the clear waters of the mangrove and ocean not yet polluted by factory refuse to make up to $32 a day. As factory workers, they stand to make the minimum wage of $3.75 a day in reduced living conditions. Billboards erected in the area, one showing a fashionably attired and coiffed Haitian woman, states, "Opportunité yon en route," or opportunities are on the way. Above her head in a dream cloud, several photographs are positioned from left to right, showing first the park, then an industrial capital above a sign for a restaurant, and finally an office worker in a clean, well-lighted space in front of her computer terminal. The message is clear. This young woman's only hope for a desk job is the opening of the park, which will also bring in an influx of manual jobs and service opportunities. Of course, it's clear that it won't be the factory workers with their $3.75 day wage who will be frequenting the planned 4 restaurants. One wonders who will. Another billboard shows an industrial worker, a female plumber in uniform, a chef and chef Weiss, and another female office worker, all smiling, a caption running beneath them stating, "Pral gen en pile business," there will be a lot of business. Yet current plans for the development of this area does not include an educational one for area schools, nor does it include area-wide training for positions for locals for jobs above the factory floor. It's clear that locals will not only lose their current occupations, including jobs in fisheries, but that most jobs coming to the area will be staffed by individuals coming from elsewhere. USAID had promised to build 750 homes for homeless or earthquake victims to be relocated to the area. But in June 2012, Brett McDonald and Deborah Sontag reported in a New York Times video piece that these homes had yet to be built, but the factory itself was nearing completion. Unemployed farmers watching the building of the factory were promised relocation out of their own area, but stated we're still waiting because they haven't given it to us yet. Another farmer stated, quote, "The best land for growing the land we grew up on is the land they took from us," unquote. Sewing factories in the park are set to operate tax-free and will supply US-based companies such as Walmart, Target, Kohl's, and The Gap. Caracol Industrial Park is a flagship project for Haiti reconstruction. The US government is sinking 1/4 of its reconstruction funding in the park that comes at a total cost of $260 million US. It is, however, well outside the earthquake disaster zone. Jose Augustin Aguirre, the Inter-American Development Bank's Haiti department manager, argues that environmental impact studies would have taken up to 10 years to conduct. Yet it is evident to locals that their food supplies and natural resources, including potable water, will be immediately impacted as soon as refuse from the plant overflows into the ocean and connected waterways. The major Korean stakeholder in the park, SAI-A, is a known violator of labor norms and human rights. The Caracol site is also notable for two more historical facts. During the US occupation, a brutal prison labor camp called Chabert Post, run by US Marines, was located here. And in 1919, it served as the gravesite of a Haitian anti-occupation crusader, Charlemagne Péralt, who was also killed by US Marines. These historical notes seem to suggest, as Laurent Dubois has argued, that, quote, Haiti was founded by ex-slaves who overthrew a plantation system, and people keep trying to get them to return to some form of plantation, unquote. The park planning actually predates the earthquake, but the earthquake crisis was seen by global investors as an opportunity to capitalize on the need for an influx of jobs. But were Haitians then or now asking for more factory jobs, especially after decades of factory exploitation, leaving them worse off than before? No effort was made to bolster local production, nor to encourage increased agricultural capacity with locals who have generational knowledge of the land and its capacities. Now, I should say that there are NGOs like Food for the Poor who have attempted and continue to work with people in the area who are fishermen. They've rehabbed 41 fishing villages along this coast, providing new boats for deep sea fishing nets and other needed supplies so that fishermen can continue in their tradition while raising their yield in a continued ecologically sound manner. But this doesn't seem to have been the interest of the larger NGOs or governing bodies like USAID or the UN. We should note here, or I'd like to note, that the UN was responsible in 2010 for infecting the Artibonite, which is the largest river in Haiti, which the tributaries of which, of course, feed other riverways in Haiti. That epidemic caused 9,000 deaths, 800,000 were contaminated, and brought cholera into the country when it had been eradicated for over 100 years. So should the USAID, the United States government, the UN, and other large NGOs be responsible for the future development of the country that it has impoverished and continues to impoverish? Earlier, I stated that there were still 50,000 people in IDP camps. In 2013, we were being told that there were no more camps in Haiti. And I came across this one in Mayotte, which is outside of the Pétionville area, outside of Port-au-Prince. And I noted that this had become a permanent camp. And you can see this from the lamps that have been erected for the nighttime. And so to conclude, or just to say a final word, Haitians in the local space, we often say, nous là, we are here. And so I think when it comes to preserving the dignity of Haitian people on the ground, access to potable water, to cultivation with rainwater, to doing what it is that Haitians know best, to cultivate their own land and to cultivate their futures, this should be left in the hands of Haitians in the local space, whether it is for sugar production or for water production, for rice and other things in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup, Myriam Chancy, for a truly wonderful talk. I see that some people are raising their hands, some participants, so I invite you to please use the Q&A function and we'll address your questions hopefully after we hear Andrea Chung. Now we'll listen to Andrea Chung. Andrea, the floor is yours.
All right, let me get the share screen going. All right, can you guys see everything? Should be a picture of a child on the front.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. This is actually just my son standing in front of one of my pieces. So my work sort of explores the relationship between materials and their imbued histories, and I focus primarily on the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean, in particular, Mauritius. Of course, my parents are from the Caribbean. They're from Jamaica and Trinidad, and my last name is Chung. So I've always been really interested in understanding the circumstances under which my grandparents found themselves to be in Jamaica. Um, so my grandfather came from China when he was 17. He was a stowaway on a ship that was supposed to stop in San Francisco, but he found himself in Jamaica. And I had always wondered, what that might have been like for someone at that age to come to a country where you don't understand the language, the culture is completely different. Um, and I wanted to think about like how people were migrating into the islands and the circumstances under that. And I started to think about items that were exported out of the Caribbean. And of course, sugar would be the number one item. So I wanted to, I was starting to think about people as being items of export or import, and how, how it sort of stripped them of their humanity when you start to think of them in that way. And I decided to take my grandfather's name and take the various transliterations of his name. We don't have a proper spelling of his name. It was Zhang Feng Chung. And it became this sort of meditative process where I wrote his name over and over again on shipping pallets. And this is sort of my first sculpture because I was thinking a lot about like the history of shipping pallets and what gets moved around from place to place and how they get used over and over again. And also looking at the different items that were exported out of the Caribbean. So the first one that I did was sugar. And then I went from there to coffee, arrowroot, and allspice. And it became sort of like this meditative process for me of like writing over and over, and during the time of making also thinking about what that transport during the transatlantic slave trade was like, and also even after the transatlantic slave trade, thinking about indentured servants from both China and India coming into the islands and trying to um, imagine what that was like and the traumas that that brought. And also thinking about when you move people from one location to the next, you're not just moving their physical bodies, you're also moving their traditions, their religions, their beliefs. So I don't think most people consider that when they're thinking about the voluntary and involuntary movement of people from one location to the next. And when I first started grad school, which is where a lot of this early sugar work comes from, this is from 2007, I had been making these portraits of my grandmother with paint and just really decided that I was not a painter, not really interested in the history of painting from a Western perspective. And I don't feel that oil paints really capture what it is, the stories I'm trying to tell. So this piece is called Agatha's Foot. And my grandmother, Agatha, would walk around Coronation Market in Kingston selling things like eggs and limes in order to make money to care for her children. But she also developed diabetes and actually passed away having her second leg amputated um, because she had gangrene. So and the fact that I had used sugar before, I was really thinking about my personal relationship to sugar. I have lots of family members that suffer from diabetes, but also with the relationship of sugar to these locations and how that material is loaded with so much history and how we take it for granted that it's this mundane object that, you could go buy a pound of sugar right now for less than $1, and you're not really thinking about the origins and the history behind this very mundane ingredient. So I decided to cast my leg out of sugar and give it back to her as a way to honor her labor. And labor is a huge part of my practice. I'm always trying to consider the labor of others. And if there's any way that I can honor their labor by making my process more laborious, then that's my goal. So these are some of the earlier sugar pieces and learning really how to use the material. Um, this is the only documentation I have of this image. It was in my studio when I was in grad school. And I just wanted to sort of experiment with what I could do with that material, how I could bend it, stretch it, sculpt it, paint with it. So this is a portrait that I did of my grandfather, and I believe it's about 10 by maybe 5 feet, no longer exists. But it was just, again, experimenting in the possibilities of the material. And this is also from, I believe, 2007. And there, again, taking the portrait of my grandmother and playing again with the possibilities of the material, except this time I'm not only painting it, but I'm also taking the material and applying it to the wall by pressing it and letting it sort of crust over and seeing exactly the process of what will happen to that material. Um, and during that time, I decided to stop looking at my family. It was a little too hard to take critiques on your grandmother personally. So I decided to, I created this series of cutouts that I was interested in finding images of slaves in the Caribbean, and none existed due to the fact that the invention of photography came after slavery had been abolished in Jamaica. And a lot of the images now that are used are actually posed images of laborers, and a lot of them are of laborers laying in cane fields, oftentimes in very submissive positions. And those photographs exist because once plantations, the economy had fallen because they didn't have free labor anymore, they moved to tourism. So those photographs were used to show the island as being still docile and submissive so that they could still have white foreigners come into the island. And I reference that because I feel that, a lot of the islands that were focused on a sugar economy went from one service industry to the next. And the next ended to be tourism. So these are sculptures that I would find in Jamaica. The first time I went to Jamaica, I was around 12 or 13. And these sculptures were everywhere. They're of Rastas that are sometimes 4 inches, 12 inches, and often life size. And you find them everywhere in tourist locations, but also you can find them in Kingston in various markets. When you would drive through the country, you would find them on the side of the roads as well. And there were some that had a barrel around them and you could pick it up and the penis would be on a spring and just bounce up and down. And then the rest of them would have these very exaggerated penises. And I want the viewer and the tourist to question, what is being sold here? What is exactly that you are buying into? And the hypersexualization of the Black body, in this case, Black men. So years later, I want to say maybe 20 years later, I went back to Jamaica and I had been sourcing a lot of tourism items like postcards. And I had remembered these, sculptures and went to a craft market and, talked to the vendors and told them what I was interested in. And they still sold them there. So I'd ask them, how do you feel about these being sold? And he would tell me that, we only sell what the tourism board tells us to sell. So there is this I'm trying to negotiate with why we need to focus on tourism in this way and sexualizing the body. A lot of commercials show the exotic beauty in them, or they tell you to come back to the way things used to be, which is referencing a time when we were colonized and often enslaved. A lot of the early posters and commercials that were shown are often of the natives wearing traditional clothing that no one actually wears, in a more sort of like genteel fashion, as if that's what the island is still like. So I just want the viewer to sort of question this. So these are some of the earlier sugar sculptures where I got the figure and cast it out of sugar. And for the duration of a month, I allowed these to slowly melt on their own and deteriorate. This, I believe, is from maybe 2010 or 11. And I really love sugar because it's a very, very challenging medium to use. A lot of working with this material is learning to lose control. You can't force the material to do what you want it to do all the time. And a big part of that was like letting go. And I kept trying to force the material to never melt. But that's not the nature of the material. It's going to melt. It's going to attract flies. It's going to be sticky. So I decided to just embrace the material and add the ephemerality and time as a part of my work, so that anytime I install these pieces, they will never quite be the same. It's an experience for the viewer. You can smell the sugar. You can see the tackiness of it. I've had, I don't know why, people attempt to taste it. I really want it to be something that you have to return to and experience it and see the constant change. So when I graduated from my grad program, I got a Fulbright scholarship to Mauritius. It's a small island nation in the Indian Ocean. It's also a former sugar colony. So I decided to go on a search for all the sugar chimneys in the area. And while I was there, I was doing research on their cuisine to use it as a way to talk about migration patterns into the island. Mauritius has a very similar history as the rest of the Caribbean. There were Indian and Chinese indentured servants that were brought onto the island. And it was actually the first site of the experiment of like mass distribution of people throughout the New World. The food is very similar to the Caribbean. The backgrounds are very similar. And I was really fascinated with this island, this part of the island in particular. This is a village called Lemourne, and that's Mount Lemourne. And at the top of that island, there were a lot of Maroons that established their own village there. They spoke their native languages, they practiced their religions, and they fished as a way to sustain themselves. And it was a very strategic planning to put a village there because it's a very difficult mountain to climb. So they were unable to be recaptured. But when slavery was abolished, they'd sent troops to, the British sent troops to let them know that they were free and also to recapture some of them. And they all committed mass suicide off the side of the mountain. And after that, those who survived were supposed to go on a apprenticeship. Once slavery was abolished, former slaves were supposed to work with their plantations for 7 years to make things a whole lot easier for them since their economy had crashed. But the Creoles in this particular part of Mauritius refused to do that. And they took on fishing as a trade. And it became this generational trade that was passed down till, currently people do still fish. But at the same time, the trade is starting to disappear and die out because they're having foreign countries come into their waters and capture all their fish. And I saw this as somewhat of a revolutionary act that they refused to take this position. And because of that, they have been stereotyped the same way in which Black Americans have been stereotyped, often being referred to as lazy or drunkards, which if you've ever fished, you know that this is not an easy profession. It takes a lot of time and patience, and you need to be very knowledgeable about the area in which you're fishing. And while I was there, my husband was fishing with a lot of locals there, and rather than use a rod and reel, they would use bottles, and it seemed to be more effective than my husband using his rod and reels. So they would take the bottle, and it's called line fishing, and you would take the line and wrap it around the bottle and cast the line into the water, and using nuts and bolts as weights, you would allow the line to sink. And then when you felt a bite, you would hand pull the line in. And with this piece in particular, it's called Sink or Swim. I was doing a residency at the McCall Center, 2013, and I was fortunate that they had the studio they placed me in. I could regulate the temperature in the space, so I got to play with the sugar and continue to experiment and see what I could do with the sugar. So I cast the bottles out of sugar and wrapped them up with fishing tackle, and allowed them for the duration of the residency, which was about 3 months, to melt and bend and do what the sugar is going to do, so that the sugar sort of takes on its own life and it starts to slowly decay and disappear, to sort of mirror their the disappearance of their fishing trade. And I always let people know that when I initially did this piece, I did not intend for any of the bottles to be broken and smashed on the ground, but someone had snuck into my studio and got caught on a hook and brought the whole thing crashing down, which eventually to me seemed to be, I was really upset, but then I was like, wow, this is actually pretty interesting. It kind of shows a further destruction, and it's a very violent destruction. So I've now incorporated that in the work. There's always smashed pieces around in the space. And again, with that same story of Lamorne and the fishermen, I decided to cast small boats out of sugar and put them in a bath of water. And over the duration of time, the boats start to slowly melt and disappear and create this rich amber color into the water. This is a more recent piece that I did in Milwaukee. I had been thinking about Audre Lorde's quote of, you can't destroy the master's house using the master's tools. And I really wanted to think about what the master's tools were. And one of the tools I thought of was a machete, just because that's what was used to cut the cane, but also thinking of tools in terms of literature and science, the Bible, religion, anything that was used to justify slavery. So I, of course, cast the sugar in the shapes of machetes, and also took elements of the Bible and also school books and art history books, and I would dip them in the sugar or rip out the pages and pour sugar on it, or dip them into the sugar, to get the viewer to sort of question how these materials have been used to continue promoting this idea of us being lesser than, and sort of exploiting the history of the Caribbean. This was a piece I did last year at the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco. And the show was called Coffee, Rum, Sugar, Gold. And I had gone there not really knowing what exactly I wanted to do, which tends to be a little bit more exciting for me when I'm playing with installation. And I had been thinking about this phrase, I swear on a stack of Bibles. And I thought I would take the piece and cast all of these Bibles and stack them up. But I was really, really pressed for time, and I cast about 100 pounds of sugar here. And within the sugar, I've taken hymnals that are very specific to Black culture, like Amazing Grace, and dipping them inside of the Bibles while they're still wet and letting them be sort of encased. I added beads to sort of represent the African retentions of religions being brought into the Caribbean, like voodoo or obia, to show that we often had to mask our religious practices with Catholicism and Christianity. There's also rice in there that sort of depicts the story of the enslaved Brazilian women that would often braid their hair and hide grains of rice in their hair so that when they were in the New World, they would have a piece of home and be able to plant these crops and grow their own crops. I'm also interested in how religion has been used to justify slavery. So this piece is called Proverbs 13:33, which directly sort of correlates to saying that God does not like those who lie. It's a loose reinterpretation of it. So I thought it was interesting that there was something called a slave Bible that existed here in the US, where slave masters would redact a lot of parts of the Bible that actually said that they were not, that the slaves were not supposed to be enslaved. And I thought it was interesting that they would just, you know, force and promote Christianity on them, but would redact the areas that could justify their freedom. So within this, I also discussed like that there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, but there is not. And so you see the cast gavel. And when I came to install the piece, I was just laying out the Bibles to sort of figure out how I wanted to arrange it. And it ended up looking like evidence in the way that I arranged it on the plinth that's on the ground. So I wanted to sort of leave it there as a representation of, look at all this evidence that I have to show you, you know, exactly how incredibly hypocritical, you know, slavery was. And at the same time, thinking about how the Bible also was a part of the civil rights movement and the Underground Railroad, and just sort of thinking about how it gets twisted along the way. I'm apologize, I'm really nervous because there's a lot of people in here. This is from my gallery solo show last year. I had been doing these large installations of cyanotypes in which I would depict images of lionfish. They are an invasive species that's in the Caribbean, and they have no natural predator in this area. And they're slowly destroying the ecosystem there. And the only thing you can really do to bring their numbers down is to eat them. And I thought that was a really fascinating way to talk about colonialism. It seemed like a great metaphor. So I started using the cyanotype printing process because, again, as I mentioned, there are no photographs of slavery in the Caribbean. And cyanotypes are one of the earliest photography methods. So I felt like there was a link there. And I'm interested in how photography has been used to represent the Caribbean through tourism imagery, through archival images. So the medium seemed to work perfect with the concept. And also I'm fascinated with the planning that went into colonialism. I had been doing a lot of research and finding blueprints for slave castles and manacles and the proper way to build a slave ship. And to me, there's something rather psychotic about that you went through the effort to plan all of these really specific things in order to make this happen. And currently reading a book on, it's called The Right to Die, and it focuses a lot on suicides during the Middle Passage. And one of the inventions that came from this was slaves would often not eat their food in order to die on slave ships. So the sailors invented this contraption that was metal that they could force into their mouths and prop their mouths wide open so that they could force feed them. And I think about the ingenuity that people put into creating these kinds of things, and it's rather disturbing. And I wanted to sort of exploit and show that with the large scale installations. So from after moving away from the lionfish, I continued making the cyanotypes, but this time looking at corals and thinking about coral bleaching and how that's completely impacted by man and how we are affecting the environment, but also thinking about corals as being regenerative. And despite the history of the subject matter that I'm discussing, I also think that there are regenerative qualities and practices that we do to try to be sustainable, even though, you know, it's kind of like fighting a losing battle. But I don't want to just like focus on, you know, the sorrow. I want the viewer to also see this as like, we are hopeful and we are taking steps towards, you know, improving things, and finding more sustainable ways to work. So these are about 60 by 44 cyanotype prints, in which with this time I have dipped the cyanotypes into white sugar, white refined sugar. And I let them soak in the sugar and crystallize, almost in the same way that rock candy is created. You can sort of just take a material in a very dense syrup of sugar and allow it to crystallize over time. So that's what happened here. And as we hung them up, I allowed the sugar to fall apart and do what it's again going to do in the space. And it took on sort of like these glimmering effects, almost sort of like glitter. And the way that they're displayed now is that they're encased in a frame, and then we take the sugar that has fallen from the piece and we put it inside of the frame. And again, I really love that it's ephemeral and that it will not last forever, that each piece has its own living history, and that you have to take care of it. You have to take care of the work, and it will continue to change over time. And these are other installation shots. The piece that's on the left, I'm sorry, is called The Litany for Survival. And you can't see it from here, but the coral pieces that are very white are hand painted with sugar, sort of like encrusted in there. These are better shots, the details. And again, whenever I'm doing these works, I really don't know what's going to happen. It's all leaving it all up to experimentation and seeing what the material will allow me to get away with. So it's scary, but exciting at the same time to try to see what I can pull off with the material. And I will always, you know, include sugar in my work. It's just something that is a part of who I am and a part of my history. I think I showed the last one. Yes. I kind of tried to limit this talk to my pieces that involve sugar, and the rest of the work you can Google online. So that's it.
Thank you, Andrea. This was really beautiful work. Thank you for sharing it with us and explaining your process using sugar as a medium. And thank you both, Myriam and Andrea, for such wonderful talks around the theme of sugar. And through both your talks, we see how sugar is so many things at once, both a medium and at the center of the history of slavery in the Caribbean, and how this history continues to shape current day crises, current day configurations, and allocations of resources. And we've seen how sugar is not an isolated element, but it requires, for instance, the precious resource of water, and is itself an ephemeral medium, which you've grappled with, Andrea. So I see there are questions in the Q&A. Erin will read them out, and hopefully you can answer them. Thank you again.
Yes, just want to echo the thanks to both of you. That was really incredible. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so if you have further questions, please feel free to keep typing away. The first is there any Is there much hope for rethink of the attitudes of USAID, the UN, or larger NGOs with the new US administration coming in?
I guess that question is for me. I would say no. There's a very long history of the exploitation of Haitian labor in this hemisphere, and is controlled by the United States in particular. I do delve into that in From Sugar to Revolution and in some of my other works. People should remember that this is not an issue, as we tend to think of the United States, of Republican versus Democratic, administrations. It's really an issue of hemispheric battles and ideological battles, which are particularly racialized. And so, because I know we have limited time for Q&A, I'll just say in a short way that people should remember that it was Clinton who actually imposed the tariffs that destroyed the rice cultivation on the island, because he wanted to divert, he wanted US Arkansas rice to be imported into Haiti at higher prices. But he was just part of a long legacy of the destruction of infrastructure in Haiti, especially for self-sufficiency. There are many books on this. One that I would recommend is written by Paul Farmer, was his book in 1994 called The Uses of Haiti. I probably should go on the record to say that that text by Farmer is not by the same farmer that we have today, but it is a very useful, handy text to understand in a very accessible way the history of Haiti and the way Haiti has been positioned in the way that it has, in order to diminish the idea that people of African descent in this hemisphere in particular can be actors in their own lives and direct their own futures. So I'll leave it at that. The answer is no.
Thank you. And the next set of questions is more for Andrea. It's about your process and your method and material creation. So some specific questions. If you've ever worked with molasses, which is very dark and sticky. Also, where you acquire the sugar you use, how you cast it, what tools you use, and how you consider the more physical elements and their natures, such as the fact that the work melts and part of it disappears, how you put that in relation to people's voices and humanity.
I don't use molasses. You can't sculpt with molasses, and the sugar that I use, it's sugar that you can get at the grocery store. I mean, I'm very much a supporter of low tech when it comes to making work, because I want, I don't have parents that know anything about art. My audience are my parents. They don't know anything about art. I never went to a museum until I was in college. So it's important to me that the materials that I use are something that anyone can go and purchase, and you're not spending $20 on a tube of paint. So when you are sculpting with sugar, it's essentially the same way a chef would use sugar. You're cooking the sugar. It's similar to the process of, I've been to a few sugar factories in Mauritius, and you see a process of the extraction from the cane, and you see the stages of when molasses is made from that sugar, and then they continue to strip more and more liquid out of it until you have pure cane sugar that has absolutely no molasses. And that's what I use to cast with. Again, Domino makes it. The brand that I use is called Zulka. You can pretty much find it anywhere. You can cast refined white sugar, I think, similarly, but this was the first time, those last few pieces that I had used, that I tend to stay away, I don't know why, from that sugar. And I slowly work with the pure cane sugar. As far as the disappearance, well, as far as the work with Mauritius, I definitely was thinking about the disappearance. I was thinking about the disappearance of trade. I don't think that all artwork needs to last forever. I think that we live in such a capitalistic world that we feel like everything needs to have a price on it, and it's like putting a price on someone's history, and I'm very much against that. So I think that you just need to experience it. You know, the first question I get was, how do you sell it? And I'm like, is that really what you're thinking about? You know, you're part of the problem because you want to commodify this work in a way that I'm not even thinking about. It's more about the experience and what you take away from the work. I make work that, you know, is for sale, but this work is, it's impossible to capture. I mean, there are ways of selling an installation, but that's never really my intention when I make them. It's just you come and you experience it, and then when it's fully melted, it's over. That's it. You know, you don't get to take it home with you. You just have to go and revisit it over and over again. What was the last question as far as like the disappearance of humanity? No, it's definitely not about the disappearance of humanity, and I think that's why I focused a lot on the corals, because while there is a ton of coral bleaching, there is a regenerative quality about the corals, and that they can reestablish themselves if they're given the space to do so, if they're not constantly bombarded by humans. You know, we're not coming in and interfering with things and um, having global warming. So I think I answered everything.
Maybe I could jump in here because I think what really struck me about the slides you were showing was, the use of putting the sugar on the Bible and the different texts, right, that have been
Mm,
utilized to oppress and colonize. And
mhm,
I think this is where I think, because I know very few writers who identified themselves on the chat earlier, but it's really important for us, who write, to produce a counter literature, counter text, and be part of that conversation that you're creating with, so that there are sort of solid pieces, archival pieces that come from us, rather than only ingesting,
mhm.
literally, texts that don't speak about us to us. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe one last question for both of you. How can the diaspora best follow the lead of those back home and be most supportive?
Listening. Listening. I think oftentimes, you know, we're still speaking from, you know, a privileged perspective because we live here. So for me to go to Jamaica or Trinidad and tell someone what they're doing wrong, I'm part of the problem. So I think there's a lot of listening and conversation that needs to happen. But as far as like answers, I mean, there are so many problems that, I mean, how do you begin? You know, it's overwhelming.
Well, I think there's a few different ways to answer that. I agree about the listening. I was thinking about the novel that I read a few excerpts from, came out of many years of listening. It's a novel I wasn't, excuse me, planning to write. I gave a lot of political talks, but political in the sense of responding to the political moment from 2010 to 2013. And every time I gave a talk, there would be Haitians who had fled Haiti or who were refugees of the earthquake, who would tell me their stories or tell me their family story. And it was a few years before I realized that the reason they gave me those stories is because I'm a storyteller as well as a critic, and but I had to do something with those stories. And that's where, the creation of these different characters came from. So there's listening in the creative process, but I think there's also listening in the critical process. I agree with Andrea that as a Haitian born Haitian who no longer lives in Haiti, I have nothing to say to local Haitians. All I can do is actually listen. And I think this has been the great mistake of the post-earthquake situation that I tried to talk about today, is that people on the ground knew what to do. They knew, obviously not in terms of the critical life-saving hours or weeks directly after the earthquake, although it does turn out that the most critical life-saving measures that occurred during those first hours and days were conducted by Haitians who had very little supplies on hand to do those measures. But I'll give you an example connected to our talks. During the weeks just following the earthquake, local producers, banana producers, rice producers, started to set up ways of distributing their produce and their products in the most hard-hit areas. And they actually pleaded with the larger NGOs and with USAID not to flood the markets because they actually produced enough to be able to feed the locals themselves. And of course, their rates of sales are, how much they charge for their products is actually quite low compared to what's being imported. So it was a moment between 3 and 6 months where local producers could actually feed their own and also start making money at the local level. And of course, they weren't listened to. And USAID did what it usually does, and other, large governmental agencies, and they flooded the market and destroyed that opportunity. So I think whenever we are looking at situations in the Caribbean and elsewhere where, a disaster occurs and is compounded by, colonialism, we really need to think about not participating in a kind of knee-jerk response with these larger entities like UNICEF, which collected huge amounts of money, or the Red Cross, and actually never dispersed it. And so we need to look at the grassroots, what's happening there. It takes more effort. You're not going to get that information from CNN, but everybody has websites today. People have networks, and we need to, as people on the outside, tap into those networks. And I did say in the chat to one person who was asking about this, but I do have a list, which I will dutifully now update, of organizations in Haiti that I have been supporting since after the earthquake, but have been doing a really great job. And that will lead you then to other organizations as well. So there are things that we can do because there are organizations that are working in their spheres of influence, addressing problems every day. And that's where we need to put our efforts, both monetarily and our listening ears.
My husband always says you need to help people the way they want to be helped.
Absolutely.
Instead of enforcing your idea of help, because oftentimes it's not helpful. And to sort of piggyback on what you were talking about as far as the bananas, there's a really great documentary that was pretty much what sparked my practice. It's called Life in Debt, and it talks about Jamaica, specifically about their banana market and what happened there when the US sort of stepped in and interfered. And it's similar to pretty much all the islands that tried to produce for themselves. It's discouraged. They want to import everything. And a lot of these farms end up shutting down. They can't compete. So just help people the way they want to be helped. I mean, it's one thing to ask someone, do you need help? But then you actually need to listen and let them tell you. Yeah.
And people are talking all the time. I think that's the other thing, is that maybe people are not expressing themselves in the ways that, people are looking for expression. And I'm reminded of peasant farmers in Haiti who have been working against Monsanto, and they organize at the grassroots level and have been rejecting, the flooding of their markets with seeds from Monsanto, which can't reproduce themselves, right? Which is the whole point, which is sponsored by Bill Gates as a human rights offering to Haiti and other parts of the third world. And here are peasant farmers with very few resources who have worked together and have actually taken legal recourse to refuse those seeds. So I think if people who have fewer resources than we do are able to access those avenues, then we need to follow suit and see what they're doing, and then support those efforts that are already being, that are already launched and taking place.
This was an incredibly inspiring and frank conversation that I think is incredible to be having. I guess we have 2 minutes left, so to wrap up, I just wanted to say that we plan to have several more interventions for this project over the course of the next year on topics, including bananas, as well as gardens and beaches. So we're hoping to include different sorts of events to deviate from this standard Zoom format that we all know so well at this point. Some ideas include a book club, a photo submission project, and podcasts. But if anyone here in this talk is interested in connecting, questioning, contributing, or engaging with the space of this platform over the next year, or on any of these themes, we welcome feedback and collaboration, of course. Whether you're an interested individual, student, professor, activist, professional already working in this space, or just someone wanting to learn more.
And to build upon that, so we will be recording this and it will go on the website of the project, and it has been recording. And I also just wanted to share that we are working, in addition to the interventions, working on a collaborative annotated bibliography project over the next year that we hope can serve as like an interactive digital syllabus. So I'm just going to share, actually, I will share my screen briefly. So one second. So this is the website for the project. And I want to echo Erin's comment that like we genuinely are welcoming of anyone who is interested in sharing their work, feedback, questions, and we would like to invite you to contribute to this bibliography project so that it can serve as a resource and a space of connecting on these issues that Dr. Chancy and Andrea have shared about and started this conversation in this particular space, but a conversation that they have been having. So yeah, we welcome you to check that out, and we will follow up with a link to be able to contribute to that.
Rachel, somebody's asking for captions. I think, did you enable the captions on the Zoom? Because Zoom does provide captions.
We do plan eventually subtitling to provide a bilingual French translation, and I do believe we'll be able to pull out captions in English as well.
Okay. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you.
S'il y a des francophones qui veulent participer, allez-y.
Thank you for inviting me to do this. Sorry for the nerves. I get super nervous when I
was nervous too. Apparently we hide it well.
Yes,
I was like getting tongue-tied the whole time.
And can I plug that my novel will be out September of 2021 with HarperCollins Canada and also with Tin House in the USA. And the essays, I'm still negotiating for the contract, but it should be out a couple of months later with the UP in the United States.
Yeah, nice.
Puis merci à tout le monde. J'aimerais quand même dire un petit mot en français. Merci à tout le monde qui est là. Et puis, Kimby, pour tout le monde qui est aussi Haïti.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Are we leaving?
Yeah,
I think so.
I didn't want to just like hit leave.
I know there's still people saying things in the chat, which is very lovely to see.
Andrea, one question for you that just popped up in the Q&A. Oh shoot, where did it go? And your images, if they're copyrighted or if they could be shared.
Share them.
It's
okay. Yeah, I think I've taken most of the pictures myself.
I did have a question about one of your pieces. Can I ask it quickly before we
leave? Of course.
This has to do with the piece that the soap hands that was installed in the Chinese Center. Mm-hmm. Did you install it at some point where people could actually put water on them? And like
you're supposed to wash your hands with the hands.
That's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
Such a powerful piece, but because when I saw it, it made me think of because I have a grandmother who was a market woman, and and it just made me think of the labor that's involved in all this kind of work, and it was just so touching to see.
My grandmother was a midwife, so
that's right.
It was just kind of like, how could I not sort of honor that, and just, I don't know, the perception of of them as being backwards or dirty, I think is just like such a colonized mind. And,
That's right.
you know, they provided a service that these women didn't have access to. So, you know, how could you label all of those like negative things on them where they were doing what they felt was God's work? And they were, you know, they really were. So that was a fun project to work on.
What have you done with the hands since? Do they still exist, or are they completely dissolved?
No, I have several pairs.
Okay.
They're actually my mother-in-law's hands. I used her because she has 9 children. Um, and I have several pairs, but the install that you saw was just purchased by someone who is going to donate it to a institution.
Oh, wonderful.
I didn't want to sell it to a private collector. I'm really
Yeah, of
particular
course.
about what I will sell
Sure.
to private collectors. And I didn't want to sell it to anyone. I just think that's weird to have in your home. So she has
No,
promised to donate it. It's like in our contract that she must donate it to an institution.
that's wonderful. I mean, because for me, I just remember when I saw it, I was transfixed, and it felt like it was the idea of rendering homage to all those women in
Yeah.
domestic service, or, you know, who did very difficult work in Caribbean spaces. So
I'll have to get your email because I have some things that you may be interested in.
I'll send you my,
Speaking to that. Yeah. So
yeah, I think we have each other's emails from the conversations with the organizers.
oh yes, that's true. That's true.
Yeah,
I was going to scroll through and I was like, oh wait, we do.
we do.
Yeah, I'll have to send you some images because I think I can sort of continue on with the midwife stuff and then I start moving on to uh, market women and Orishas and washerwomen and all kinds of stuff. So
yeah. Oh, wonderful. And this gave an opportunity to the organizers to send a lot of links in the chat to everyone who's still here.
I'm surprised there are people still here.
Oh, we're still talking. We're still talking, right? Well, this has been lovely.
All right.
Thank you both again.
Thank
So
you.
much.
Yeah, thank you so
you.
much.
Have
All right.
a great day.
Have a lovely
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
bye.